Bonjour, je vais passer en anglais puisque Alex, ZACK et Caroline viennent des États-Unis, donc on va switcher. I'm super happy to be here this morning. I'm Max, I'm a designer and product lead at Meetup, and a few months ago when the team from the Web2day reached out, I was pretty sure it was to talk about design, scaling products fast, but I don't think we can have that conversation anymore if we're not talking about the products that we're designing and scaling in the first place. And I think that's because 2018 is a critical year for tech. If you look at everything that's happening, from like the Facebook scandal, everything that happened to Uber, like we're realizing that tech in itself is not good. It's not especially good. It can bring some bad in the world, like not have like positive impact. And so it's just neutral. Tech is just what people do with it, what the companies are doing with it. If I give you like a few examples, what happened last year in the US, for example, we had Facebook let advertisers target very specific population in the US to make sure that they were going to vote for Trump, and that worked. And that went without any kind of oversight. If you look at Airbnb, for Airbnb used to let hosts basically decide if they wanted to accept a guest or not, and that just leaves so much space for discrimination, because if you're black and you're trying to get an Airbnb and the host can see your profile and decide, like they can discriminate in a way that even an hotel cannot. If you look at YouTube, we have talked a lot about YouTube recently in the news because their algorithm is supposed to be super powerful, right? It's like if you love cats video, you're going to see one, and then you're going to see a lot of cats video, and that's super cool. But if you start watching one ISIS video, and you get 10 and you get 100, like YouTube can become like a super powerful beacon for radicalization, conspiracy theories. So these are just examples, but if you think about it, these have been created by companies that have as a mission statement like, we do not be evil, like make the world a better place, make the world more open and connected. So on principle, it was supposed to be great, but we realized that the execution, the product that we're building, all of it is a little more nuanced, and it's a little more complicated. And so that's why this morning, I'm super, super excited to have invited these three friends to talk about positive technology. And what positive technology is, it's a movement which goal is to basically realign everything that tech is doing, whether we're building new services or like the way we're running our companies, in terms of culture, mission. It's to make sure that it's realigned with positive impact on people, so making sure that people feel better with the services that you're building, but also positive impact on society at large. Like we're not basically like destroying a democracy or just making people even more depressed because they're not getting enough likes from their friends when they're posting an Instagram picture. So we're going to talk about all of this morning, and so I'm just going to quickly introduce everyone on the panel. The idea is that we're going to use the first hour for them to share like their own presentation. They will have 15 minutes each, and then we'll use the second hour as a panel so that you get to ask us questions, because that's really what we're here for. We're super happy to make this a conversation. So Alex Glass, who's on the right. Hey, Alex. So Alex has been working at Amazon for 5 years as a business strategist there. And after that, he started studying like positive psychology. And so he's going to share everything that positive psychology is, how you can measure it, so that it's not about just saying like, oh, we're going to try to make people happy. It's like we can actually measure it and we can see if what we're building actually has impact on people. So I'm super excited for you to, when I saw the presentation the first time, like that was really a clear way to understand like how we can make things better. Whether like if you're in this room, it's because you care about tech or you work in tech. And so whether you work at a company, an agency, you're on your own, you're a freelance, like this, what Alex is going to talk about is going to be super useful to understand how it can apply to your work. ZACK PRAGER also studied positive psychology, and he's going to talk about how the environments that we have, our devices, the fact that we let ourselves kind of being distracted by every notification. Right now, it's just because things are like this, you know, it's like, well, but my phone is in my pocket, I have notifications on, so I get something, I just read it. He's challenging the status quo. He's a hacker, he's building new ways for us to make sure that we're creating spaces where we're not distracted. And so I'm super excited for you to start, you know, looking at a potential better world where we're controlling our devices and we're not being controlled by our devices. And finally, CAROLYN, who's here this morning as well with us. CAROLYN works at Meetup with me. She's the vice president of community. She's passionate about two things. One is what's a company culture and what's its mission. And she's going to talk about these two things. And in particular, she's going to share with us like a few principles that make it easier to understand, like how can positive technology, you know, really work. And if you're running a company or if you're on your own and you're trying to make sure that when you need to make big decisions, whether it's in your business model, whether it's in the way you hire people, how you work with your partners, like every other people that interacts with your company, like when you have to make these big decisions, like that's where what CAROLYN is going to talk about is going to become super helpful, because she's going to share this principle, and I'm really excited for all of us to learn about this morning. So we're going to start with Alex. I think your slides are going to be up super soon, and can't wait. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you, Max. I'm really excited to be here today with all of you and to have this conversation. Today, I'm going to be talking about positive technology. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about how we can use technology and positive psychology, the new field that studies well-being from a scientific perspective, together to create a more flourishing world. Before we begin, I want to note that we live in a really special time. The world we live in is objectively getting better. 30 years ago, 35% of the population lived in absolute poverty, earning less than $1.90 a day. Today, that's down to around 10%. 30 years ago, 12 million kids under the age of 5 were dying every year. Now it's down to 5 million and getting better every year. We've eradicated entire diseases that were killing millions of people a year. Infant mortality is down, child labor is down, crime rates are down, and these are all amazing things of the world we live in today. At the same time, and in part driving some of these objective measures, technology adoption is accelerating at a pace like never before. It took 35 years for the telephone to reach 25% of the population in the US. It took 26 years for the television to do the same thing. The internet achieved 25% adoption in the US in just 7 years, the smartphone in just 4 years. And keep in mind, the iPhone was launched around 10 years ago, and around that time we were spending 20 minutes a day on our phones. Now we spend over 3 hours on our phones consuming digital media alone. Facebook was founded in 2004, and now it has access to over 2 billion users a month. The speed of technology is increasing at an ever faster rate. And what does this do for us? Well, it often makes for really incredible advancements. We're at a stage in life where we can use technology to detect and even cure some diseases. We've leveled the information playing field around the world. And we're using technology to start to solve some of the biggest human problems we face today. However, it's not all good. The world is objectively getting better. Technology is moving at a faster pace than ever before in history, but the world isn't flourishing. I'm going to define flourishing in a moment, but keep in mind, when they did a scientific research study in Europe, they found that depending on what country you live in, around 10 to 40% of the population was flourishing. That means a lot of people are not flourishing. In America, when they asked the question, how many people can you turn to when you want to discuss important matters, the most popular answer was 0. Compare that to 3 years ago when it was 3. The world is getting better, technology is moving faster than ever, but there's a new frontier we have to face, and that is flourishing, human flourishing. So, I promised a definition. What do we mean by flourishing? There are a few different definitions of flourishing in the scientific community, but at the baseline of all of these, there's kind of two important things we need to know. One, flourishing is a measure of well-being and mental health, and it's a descriptor of well-being and mental health. And that's why I'm going to use flourishing for the rest of this presentation. To help explain this concept a little bit more, I want to talk about a field that I've been studying myself, positive psychology. This field was introduced just 30 years ago. It's one of the youngest scientific fields out there. In 1998, Dr. Martin Seligman, who had been studying psychology for decades, was elected to be the president of the American Psychological Association. And when he was elected, he did a lot of thinking and reflecting on his path as a psychologist and where the field needed to go. And in his own words, he realized, and he said, that the focus of psychology on pathology, this traditional psychology of moving us from -10 to 0 and facing things like mental illness, anxiety, and depression was really important, but it created a lack of positive features when we talk about human beings. In other words, it was getting people from -10 to 0, but it wasn't creating a more flourishing world. And so he founded positive psychology. And for the last 30 years, psychologists have been focused on what makes a flourishing life. How do we create and cultivate more positive emotion, meaning, accomplishment, and engagement in our lives? And not only how do we cultivate it, how do we define them? How do we measure them? And how do we apply this to other fields? Well, to do this, to move any field along in science, you need to have a really clear definition. So they spent the first few years coming up with validated measures to actually measure well-being and the elements that comprise it. Once they did this, they were able to take activities that we do every day and measure them against whether they were helping or hurting well-being. To focus on some of the positive things, they found some things that maybe weren't surprising. Sleep, eating well, physical activity, all these things were correlated and actually drove more well-being. But they also discovered there were a lot of new mechanisms, really small and easy validated ways to increase well-being through the elements that comprise it, whether that's through gratitude, through kindness and compassion, through meaning and purpose, or through social relationships and love. As they were going along this journey, they circled back to this kind of moment Martin Seligman had, where they realized that getting rid of the bad doesn't mean you're creating more good. Getting people from -10 to 0, now with scientific evidence, was getting them to 0. And it wasn't helping them flourish. It wasn't helping them live the lives we all want to live, full of positive emotions and substantial social relationships and achievement in our lives. And so why is all this important? Why have psychologists been moving to this field of positive psychology and spending decades of their lives focusing on these things? Well, to demonstrate this, I want to try an experiment with you guys. For the next 10 seconds, I want you to think about the 1 or 2 things you want most out of your lives. Go ahead, I'll give you guys 10 seconds. Okay, remember those things. I'm now going to go through a list of some of the topics that these positive psychologists have been studying for the last 30 years. And I'm not only going to talk about the elements of well-being, but I'm going to talk about what having high well-being drives in your life. So remember the prompt, 1 or 2 things of what you want most in life. When I say one of these aspects of positive psychology, if you could raise your hand and keep your hand up. Positive emotion and happiness. Meaning and purpose. Earning potential and accomplishment. Social relationships and love. Health and longevity. Pretty much everyone's hands are in the air. The reason these people are studying these topics and understanding how to cultivate them and bring them to other fields is because these are the things that make life worth living. Okay, so how does technology come into play? We're at a really unique time in which you talked about the scale of technology and the speed of adoption is faster and bigger than ever before. The opportunity for us to use technology to help create a more flourishing world is massive. We're literally talking about companies that can start 10 years ago and reach billions of people around the world. But we have to ask ourselves, Are we doing this? The truth is, as we talked about earlier, there are a lot of tech companies doing this, helping to solve massive world problems and creating flourishing in the world. But research is starting to catch up with a lot of other technology that's not doing this. In a time when we're more connected than ever before, entire countries are calling out for help of social epidemics, social isolation epidemics. Social isolation is on the rise, as is anxiety and depression and envy. And the things that are going down are the things that really make us human. One of the scarier things about all of this is that academia takes time. Research is slow, it's validated. They make sure they're doing the right things to have conclusive results. And technology, moving at a rate as fast as it is today, makes it really hard for researchers to catch up. And so we don't even know what the long-term effects of some of this are going to be. Not only for ourselves, for which psychologists are really worried about our relationships and our health, but for our children who are growing up with phones from the ages of 3 or 4, from tablets and TVs. And multitasking has been shown to lead to increased depression, anxiety, and make it even harder to read human emotions. So we don't know what the long-term effects are going to be. And of course, it's not just researchers that feel this. It's all of us. We all want to live these lives that are flourishing with positive emotion and meaning and purpose. And we know when we're not. We feel it. And I want to read a quick letter from a second grader who was asked by their teacher, "Tell me one invention you don't like." The second grader said, "If I had to tell you what invention that I don't like, I would say that I don't like the phone. I don't like the phone because my parents are on their phone every day. A phone is sometimes a really bad habit. I hate my mom's phone, and I wish she never had one. That is an invention that I don't like." This was one of 4 second graders to say this exact same thing to the teacher when asked. This is a problem, and it's up to us to help solve it. The amazing thing is that the speed of technology allows us to do really quick things to make the world a better place. We're just starting to realize with well-being research the downsides of some of these things, and it's up to us to fix it. And now with technology and the science of well-being behind us, we actually can. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that might look like. First, like most human issues, we can be informed. We can understand the negative effects of overusage. We can understand our own data consumption. How often are we using smartphones or picking them up or using certain apps? And does it make us happier? When we understand the psychological tricks that some of these companies are using to bring us into their platform because it's how they make money, we can start to fight against it and apply pressure. And that's exactly what's been happening. The amazing thing is over the last few years, it's actually working. Google and Apple very recently launched well-being initiatives for their phones to help us manage the way we use Apple and Google devices. These well-being initiatives help notify us when we're using an app for longer than we wanted to. They help us pocket notifications in a way that actually makes them useful to us, as opposed to constantly barraging us to get us back into their phones. And it allows us to better understand our data consumption, the first step to realizing that maybe we have a problem. It's not surprising that we are able to do this when we can get Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, to say, "Hey, I looked at my own data and I pick up my phone too many times a day and I spend too many hours a day using my phone." We're living in a world now where we have the CEOs of these tech superpowers actually quoting positive psychology research in the real light. There are parts of using Facebook that drive increased well-being, direct one-on-one messaging with friends. But Mark Zuckerberg even says there are parts, like passively scrolling in your newsfeed, that have been shown to decrease well-being. Whether or not a company like Facebook can quickly shift their business model or piss off their shareholders to actually implement these things, I don't know. But it's the conversations we need to be having. The same thing's happening at Google. They have launching some really amazing technology, and specifically AI that has the potential to change the world. But they're realizing that we can have conversations like, should we build this or should we partner with this company versus can we? In fact, when they tried to partner with the US government to work on defense, the Google employees stood up Some resigned. Some said this isn't how we want to build and use technology, and now they're no longer doing that, and they're not renewing their contract. We at a grassroots level have a lot of power. Same thing with Amazon. A lot of people were getting worried about their kids using the smart assistant Alexa. Tens of millions of households now have Alexas. And kids were using it in ways that you don't really want to teach them in terms of their cognitive abilities or social relationship functioning. And so they partnered with child development experts, and they actually launched a new set of features specifically for kids, encouraging them to say please and thank you. Is this going to solve all the potential problems? Probably not. But is this moving in the right direction and potentially solving some problems before we get there? Definitely. In addition to fixing existing technology, we have the opportunity and now the science to actually build products, software, and hardware that can help make the world flourish. Often, these companies use well-being research to decide how to make and design their products. There's a few of these companies out there. Hopefully, there will be more soon. I'm just going to quickly highlight 3 of them. Headspace spreads meditation and mindfulness around the world. Meditation has been shown to actually change our brain structure for the better after just 8 weeks of regular practice. Meetup uses technology to get people off of technology and form real social connections. Social connections have been shown to be more important for our well-being and health than things like not smoking or obesity. And Duolingo helps us learn new languages that can help connect the world and has been shown to drive cognitive functioning improvements. Similarly, in this new world, we can measure and optimize what we're doing for well-being. We can actually use the validated questionnaires that positive psychologists have created, or we can use more simpler ways to use kind of language we're all comfortable with and measure elements of well-being. Is this product we're designing creating more happiness and positive emotion? Is it creating more meaning and purpose? Is it helping build a more kind and compassionate world? And if so, how much, how come, and how can we optimize to do more of this? And finally, and this is kind of a cry to all of you guys, we have so much power in being able to decide where we work and what we work on. Tech companies sink or swim based on their employees. And as people who work in tech or work around tech, it's really up to us to decide if we want to work for companies that are driving society forward in terms of well-being or tearing it apart. And we have that power to make that decision. Ultimately, we can design technology for human flourishing. The world is objectively getting better. Technology is moving faster than ever before. We can launch companies that scale to billions of users within 10 years to drive the world we want to. And you know, it's early days in all of this research, and it's early days in realizing the downsides of the technology we've created thus far. But at the rate everything's moving, every day counts. And together, all of us with the wider technology community can use this amazing superpower to create a more flourishing world. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. I think the easiest is we're gonna hear from ZACK and CAROLYN as well. And before jumping right into the panel, if you have specific question about some of their presentation, we can maybe just have a few questions before the panel itself. So now we're gonna continue with that. ZACK, you're gonna present us a new way to think about our spaces when it comes to the way we have been interacting with our devices so far. So the floor is yours.
Thanks. Hey guys, I'm Zach. I'm from a positive tech startup called Ransomly, and we are trying to create more spaces for humanity. I'll talk a little bit more about what that is. First, positive technology, what is it? For me, it's really simple. It's just a user experience that's informed by this new science of well-being that Alex had outlined. And I'll dive a little bit deeper into that and how we've used that to build a product. But first, I want to start with a story with Kanye West, about Kanye West, because I don't get to do that very often. And so recently I was on a project and I came across a bit of code, something like this. And for those of you guys that aren't developers, this code basically says, if the user is Kanye West, present this one user experience. For all other users, present this other user experience. So, I asked the team, like, what the heck is going on here? Because it's not that often you see, Kanye West email in an if statement. And they told me that, yeah, Kanye's a user, but he's really aggravated with our user experience, and he demanded something a little bit better. It was frustrating him, and so they decided to update it. I wanted to share that because I think it's relevant to the positive tech discussion, but it's also just, sort of a war story, and I'm sure we've had terrible clients, right? And this might take the cake. So let's get back to the science. I'll come back to Kanye and why that is relevant. So when we talk about the science of well-being, we can get more granular, right? We can get deeper, we can get more detailed. The data is showing us that well-being, happiness, flourishing, it basically comes down to these 5 components. These are positive emotion, engagement. If you don't know what engagement means, that's like sort of like how connected you are to your work. Are you engrossed? Does it really challenge you in the right ways? Relationships, so that's friendships, romantic relationships, family, meaning and purpose. Are you connected to something deeper, bigger than yourself, and then accomplishment that is sort of your career. So we have, and this is data now, right? So it's not just guessing like what makes us happy. Like this is, when you study people that are really flourishing, like this is what they have. They have all 5 of these, or they have 4 of these, or they're really, really strong in a couple of them. So it gets really exciting because now we can quantify like what makes people flourish. So for me and my team, we just ask a very simple question, is the use of our smartphones, is it making us any happier? And now, we don't have to guess, right? We don't have to do the anecdotal evidence. We can actually look at real data, which is super, super exciting. So we start with the positive emotions, right? So is the use of our smartphones, are they making us happier? Are they improving our moods all the time? Well, the early research is in, and it's clear that they are not. It's not that you cannot have your mood boosted sometimes when you're on your phone, but overall, the mood is stagnant, or it's even upset a little bit. So people report being jealous, they report sadness. I think this is mostly due from comparison, because our sort of popular social media, it's geared to compare each other to each other. Disappointment, this is a really sad one, I think, because it's something like you go out and you have a nice day at the park, you're with your dog, you love it, you're relaxed, you take a picture of it, you want to share it, you post it, right, and it only gets like 2 likes, and now you're disappointed, right? You loved it, you loved the experience, but now it's sort of spoiled a little bit because you didn't get enough likes. So, the way that our current sort of software landscape is designed, it's not optimized to improve our emotions. Okay, relationships, we can look that, is the use of our smartphone improving our relationships? Are we feeling more connected to each other? I think this is a super telling finding from a recent study here, that people are more likely to reach for their smartphone first thing in the morning than their spouse, right? And I think it's a little bit insane. If you don't think it's a little bit insane, just replace the word smartphone with any other household appliance. So, if someone is reaching for their, toaster first thing in the morning over their spouse, right? It becomes obvious that this is a little bit crazy. Like our relationship is not, it's not optimal. This is really interesting finding too. Now, if you just have your smartphone out, right? It can be off, it can never come on. If it's just out, like on a table, when you're having a conversation, that conversation will be worse. Because we will be a little bit, or they speculate, the researchers speculate that we'll be a little bit more guarded, there's less empathy, there's less vulnerability, so you're less revealing when you talk to that person. We're just a little bit on guard now when we have these smartphones around. Empathy, which is this idea of being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes. This has gone way, way down in college students. And it coincides with the rise of smartphones. It may not be causal, but it's really, really likely culprit. And fubbing, and who knows this term before this? Has anyone seen this term before, fubbing? Zero. Wow, okay. So that's good. Well, you guys are doing a good job, I think, in France. So fubbing is just phone plus snubbing, so it's the idea of ignoring someone in favor of your phone. And people that do this have worse relationships overall. Okay, so that's our moods, our emotions, and then our relationships. Now let's look at the sort of achievement and engagement side of it. What we find is that because these phones are interrupting us so often that we're forced to multitask, right? And we all think we can multitask, but the problem is the research shows that we can't actually multitask. You know, like multitasking is like losing 10 points off your IQ, or it's like working high off of marijuana or something like that. So, you know, unless you're a reggae musician or something like that, it's probably going to hurt your work. The other thing here is we drastically underestimate how long it takes us to recover from a distraction. Researchers find it takes about 25 minutes to recover, right? So, you know, for me, that means that when I first saw this, I realized I'd probably gone months, maybe years, without really deep concentration, right? Because I'm constantly interrupted, or at least I'm interrupted within that 25-minute window every single day, which was pretty sad. Okay, so that's just some of the evidence. There's more and more evidence coming in. And of course, I'm focusing on the negative sort of impacts, but it's pretty clear that, you know, the smartphone, our use of it, it is at least sometimes getting in the way of our happiness. It's not nudging us towards flourishing. So how do we get here? You know, I don't think there is some evil mastermind or something like that behind us trying to make our lives a little bit less optimal. Really, it just comes down to the attention economy. The people that won, the companies that won in social media were the ones that offer their services for free. But when you do that, you have to grab attention. So all of our designers, all of our product managers, all of our developers, we were optimizing our systems to grab attention. That gives us awesome software, but it has side effects, right? Because it's not optimized for well-being. We're not trying to make lives better. We're just trying to grab attention. So some of the kings of social media have now come out and since admitted this, that well, the whole idea was to get people addicted to their phones, right? And it wasn't sort of like this like cynical thing. They weren't masterminding evil plan. It's just sort of the market forces that got us here. So what can we do about it? So my team, we create these spaces for humanity, and this idea is just to carve out spaces for connection and for deep work. So these are spaces without cell phones, without distraction. We just go back to being ourselves the way we were, you know, maybe 15 years ago or something like that. The idea is analogous, I think, to smoking, because when we discovered that smoking was bad for us, what did we do? We carved out spaces where we say it's non-smoking. So I think now that we know that our use of smartphones are getting in the way of our moods and our relationships and our work, that we should also carve out spaces that are distraction-free. The way my team does this is we have these Bluetooth beacons, and you have an app, and then when you come in range of one of these beacons, it shuts down your phone. So you can put this like in your dining room or something like that, or the conference room or the bedroom, and then you create this sort of non-smartphone space. Here's just a demo of it. I'm using it, my phone in my bedroom at this time, just checking Instagram as I will often do, and I walk out into the room with the beacon, and it shuts down my phone, and I can't get out of that even if I try. So there's the beacon. And then I notice someone's in the room. So that's the idea, right? So you shut down your phone, you look up, and you're like, oh, wow, yeah, there's my wife. And yeah, this is the idea. The early evidence is in for this idea, and it all looks positive. It's just as you would expect. Once we review the evidence for what is going on with our smartphones, so when we do carve out space, you do improve your mood, you do have more focus, there's less risk of being addicted to it, developing these unhealthy patterns. So also the idea is catching on, at least in the States, is gaining some traction. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's touched a nerve. I think a lot of us sort of have this sense, this sort of frustration with our phones. We kind of know that they're not optimized, not really serving us at all times. So yeah, we're getting a little bit of traction with this idea, and I hope some of you here join us. What else can we do? And that was just one product that we built, and this is basically the process, right? So you guys can bake this into any product that you want. You can draw from this wealth of research. Now it's about 3 decades worth of research on what makes people happy. There's these journals, there's these centers, there's books, there's experts. You can get a lot of ideas for that. You can build a new UX. redesign a UX, and then you can measure. That's huge, right? I mean, especially for the bigger companies that have all this data coming in, right? You can measure on any of these aspects of, is your user experience improving mood? Is it improving engagement? Is it improving relationships or meaning or accomplishment? That's really exciting, right? Because I think it's good for the bottom line too. Eventually, everyone wants to be happier, right? I think that this is really, really exciting time because not only can you do good for your users, it can be a competitive advantage. So that's really, really rare, I think. Okay, so back to Kanye, because this is the other thing I think that is important. When I first came across that code where he was demanding his own user experience, I thought, he was being like Van Halen in the M&Ms. And if you haven't heard of this story, so Van Halen is this very popular band in the 80s in the United States. But they would refuse to go on and play their concerts unless they had a bowl of M&Ms with all the brown M&Ms removed. So it's sort of like this insane, like rock star ego, super ego, ego trip. And I thought Kanye was just being like that, but for the 21st century. But as I thought it through, and I just sort of looked at all this research, I realized that maybe not. Maybe he's just ahead of his time, right? Like all he was doing was demanding that, the software that he was consuming made his life better, right? Didn't get in the way of his life. It actually improved his life. So I came to side with Kanye, and I think that all of us, if we're just a little bit more like Kanye as users, as developers, designers, entrepreneurs, I think we'll be in a better world. But I do want to stress, just be like Kanye just in this one case, because he does say a lot of interesting things. But as a user, if you can demand better and expect software to be serving your life, nudging you towards flourishing, I think that we'll be all a little bit better off. So thank you guys for your attention, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Zach. And now we're going to hear from CAROLYN.
Hi. Okay, so my name is CAROLYN Manning. It's really lovely to see all of you. I have a bit of a confession. About 4 years ago, I deleted my Facebook account. We don't know each other, obviously, so I'm not a Luddite. I am socially adept. I have really close friendships. I feel confident in what I would put on out in the social world, but I found that I was spending a lot of time on Facebook, and I would check it about maybe every 30 minutes or so. And sometimes I would spend actual time on it, and sometimes I would just check in. But I noticed that I was feeling a bit of this kind of meh feeling, like, oh, my friends from college are doing that thing and I'm not. Or, look, my friends are traveling here and I'm actually just stuck in Washington, D.C., wishing I was in Mexico. And so I started to feel a little like comparison, like Zach mentioned. And so I deleted it. It took me a full 8 hours to delete my Facebook account. They make it really, really challenging, but I persevered. And it turns out that now, as these guys are sharing, a couple of years later, that feeling is being justified scientifically. And one of the current studies that showed, that was actually a really good example of what's happening, is they took about 5,000 Americans and they studied them over the course of 2 years, between 2013 and 2015. And what they saw was that an increased use of Facebook or increased activity on Facebook can lead to a decrease in well-being. I think we all kind of know this intuitively, but it's nice to see it confirmed. And I mean, even Sean Parker, the former president of Facebook, said that the product is actually meant to exploit a certain kind of human vulnerability, a psychological human vulnerability. And I think that Alex and Zach have made a really good case that we don't want to exploit human vulnerability in order to be successful. The thing that will actually make us successful is to create products that allow us to flourish. And so I think the question that I'm interested in answering is, how do we do that? So to create products that flourish, I think we need companies that are really committed to having a positive impact on the world. And so I've been thinking a little bit about, well, how do we do that? How do we make sure that we create a company culture that's geared towards having a positive impact? And at least in the tech industry, we have lived by this motto of move fast and break things. And my feeling is we don't want to break things. The point is not to break things. The point is to build things that allow people to flourish. And in order to do that, in order to build products that allow people to flourish, you need to have a company culture that allows people to flourish. And so I often get asked, because it's a bit nebulous, company culture, what does that even mean? Like when you have a cultural seat, like a chief cultural officer is like, what does that person do all day? I think that there's 4 ways that you can really create and impact a company culture. So the first would be your mission and your purpose. Why is it that you're all there? What are you getting up to do every single day? The second is the employee experience. What kind of experience are you creating for your employees such that they can get up to the thing that you want to create? The third is, who are you bringing in as partners and co-collaborators and whatever it is that you're creating. So I'll get into a little bit more about what that means with a specific example. And the fourth, of course, is the business model. Is everything that you're doing reinforcing your business model? If it's not, then it's all just fluff. And so I'm going to talk through 4 companies that I think are doing this really well, and then we'll jump into our panel and have a conversation about it. Okay, so the first is Kickstarter. Kickstarter is, has everybody heard of Kickstarter? Raise your hand if you've heard of it. Yeah, it's pretty well known. So it's a fund sourcing platform that allows creatives to get their projects done. And what's so interesting, it's based in New York, and we happen to know a lot of employees, because Meetup is also based in New York. We happen to know a lot of employees from Kickstarter, and every decision that they make is based on whether or not it's more likely to help a creative person get their project funded. And so their mission and their purpose actually becomes their filter. And if you go to their homepage and spend any time in any of their products, it's completely saturated with all these incredible projects getting off the ground and seeing the light of the day. So they're committed to their mission. That's why they work there. The second is Asana. So Asana is also a really interesting company. It's a software that allows teams to function better. It's like a really high-end project management tool. And what's interesting about Asana is that they spend a lot of time focusing on their employee experience. So internally, because they're trying to impact the employee experience of other companies. And so internally at Asana, they recognize that unless they're focusing on their own employee experience, they can never build a product that allows other people to focus on their employee experience. And so they have a lot of personal development. They have a lot of bottom-up decision-making. They have a lot of feedback conversations, in-the-moment feedback conversations, so you're not just waiting for your review for feedback, because they recognize that their employees really need to get it in order to build it. Okay, so the third one, I'm going to try it and say it in French, and you tell me if it's right. La Ruche qui douille? Yeah? Okay, I'm from Long Island, so that's not an easy thing to do. It's food assembly. And everybody knows food assembly here? Yeah. Oh, it's French, no? Is it not French? Yeah. Well, this is a really important company for you guys to know, because they are connecting local consumers with local producers. So I chose food assembly to discuss because they do a really good job of respecting the ecosystem of partners. So any company is only as successful as the people that they collaborate with. Take Uber, for example. So Uber, when they're creating their business model, they're not necessarily thinking about their drivers. They're thinking, how many people can they get in cars and how much money can they make? Food assembly wants the whole ecosystem to thrive. So they want their farmers to be connected to their consumers and to cut out the middleman. And they know that in order to be successful, they need their farmers to be successful. So they pull them in as co-collaborators and partners, and it makes the whole ecosystem thrive. And then the last, of course, is BlaBlaCar. These guys are doing an incredible job. Their mission is to decrease traffic, fill seats, and decrease carbon emissions. And we don't have anything like this in the US. Even our colleagues are using it. Some of us are going to London. They're thinking about using BlaBlaCar. It's an incredible product. What is so fascinating about BlaBlaCar is that the things that they track in their business model, here you can see like how many travelers are using BlaBlaCar, what's their carbon emission reduction like, is exactly related to their mission, right? The two are intimately connected. Whereas if you look at Facebook, Facebook says here that their mission is to give people the power to build community. But what they're measuring is how many daily and monthly active users they have. That's because Facebook's customer is the advertisers. It's not necessarily about building community. And so there's a disconnect there, which is why we've been feeling a bit of a disjointed experience with Facebook, because you think it's about building community, but then what you realize is that their purpose and mission is actually to sell ad space. And so the two things are at odds with one another. So I have a full disclosure. I work for Meetup, so I feel like you should know that before I dive into Meetup. But Meetup does a lot of these things really well. And I just wanted to take a minute to talk a little bit about some of the things that we're doing. So Meetup is a product that creates communities that meet in real life, Our purpose and our mission is to bring people together in real life to create community and opportunity for everyone. So millions of people around the world are getting online to get offline to pursue their passions together in community. Our employee experience, the thing that really makes us different is that we're committed to diversity and inclusion. And this isn't something that happens accidentally. You actually have to choose to be committed to diversity and inclusion. Otherwise, you just find people that look just like you and have your exact same experience. So you have to be committed to finding people that bring different opinions into the workspace so that you can create a more diverse product. And this is important for us because we're building a product that's for everyone. So our employee experience needs to be for everyone. The third one is around partnerships. So like Food Assembly has partnerships in their farmers. We have partnerships in our organizers. So our organizers are our customers. They pay us in order to create groups. And they're co-collaborators in the product because part of the product is, you know, when you're on your phone and you're searching the app and you're looking for the best meetup for you to go to. But then the second piece of our product is actually showing up at the meetup. And we have nothing to do with that. That's all our organizer that's creating that. So we need to make sure that we're taking care of our organizer, our ecosystem, so that we're all thriving. And then the last is our business model. So again, because our mission is to bring people together in real life to create community and opportunity for everyone, the thing we track and measure for ourselves is how many people are showing up. Because what matters to our organizers is that they create meetups and people show up to those meetups. So that's the metric that we're tracking. So it reinforces our business model. And the thing that's interesting that we're developing is, because of thanks to Alex and a lot of his well-being work, is that we're thinking about how do we measure life impact connected to meetups. So if you join more meetups, you have a better sense of well-being. And so we're actually incentivizing impact in the product. So I'm going to show you a quick video about what that could look like.
The whole idea of today, the whole idea of Meetup, the whole idea of my talk today is going to be about making people feel like they belong, making people feel welcome.
We're doing with this program and this whole idea is that we are going to be the first technology company to systematically understand if we are changing people's lives and optimize our platform to have more impact on lives.
Imagine that. Like, imagine you could just go out in the world and just rely on other people.
It will pay off in a way that you never thought possible. And lives will be transformed. And that's what it's about.
I'm just so grateful that you've had me here.
About a year ago, I stopped leaving my house. I got an email for this. It gave me a drive to come out and experience and listen to everybody's story.
Little by little, group by group, meetup by meetup, we are changing the world.
So I think the reason why Max and I were excited to talk today is because the interesting thing about having a product that creates a positive impact is that you need to have a company culture that is engaged with creating a positive impact. You can't retrofit that in. You can't say like, oh, we're gonna create this product that's gonna reach billions of people, but then we're gonna do all this nice stuff on the side to ignore the fact that we're driving for ad sales. And so my request for you all, as if you're building things and creating companies, is to consider the company culture first, build it on the inside, and then let it bleed out. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. I have a lot of questions for all of you. I just want to make sure that we open it to the audience first. If you have a question on any of the three presentations or for all of the three presentations, raise your hand. Otherwise, we can also just start the panel. And also feel free to ask your question in French or English, no other language, sadly. Won't be able to translate or understand the question.
Morning, Alexi. So thank you for these presentations. Very interesting to see how positive technology is being brought up more and more and how it can impact not only people's life, but also how companies are shaped and created. One question for me, I've been working in tech for 20 years or so. With the technology adoption that is at a speed that has never been seen before, with the fact that it's somewhat distracting us from meaningful things, don't you think that it's time also to include a dimension in the way we measure technology as the impact on resources and impact on the planet? We don't hear it a lot because it's not very a sexy subject, but we know that resources are getting more and more scarce. And I think at some point companies will have to understand, is it now time to move from high-tech to low-tech and really stop consuming things that we know will come to an end at some point? So what will be your take on that?
I can let you guys find time to answer. I have one thing that I want to mention that goes to your point. That's something that when I moved to the US, that's something that I discovered, that there are a lot of things that don't work in the US that we do better in Europe. I'm super happy about that. But there is one thing that they do better, is that they have two types of companies now. You have a C Corp, and a C Corp is a for-profit company, and it doesn't have to have any positive impact on the world. It can be the most negative impact ever. It's a C Corp. And you have a B Corp. And a B Corp, for example, that's Kickstarter. It's couch surfing as well. And to be a B Corp, it's a label, but it's also an economic incentive. Like if you're a B Corp, you're taxed differently in the US. But to be a B Corp, you have to go through all these different criterias, and that includes impact on the resources. There are many other criterias, but just having, for example, like at the state level, created a legislation that says like, hey, this company is having positive impact and this one is not. So why are we not, leveling the field? Because this one is going to do whatever they want to be successful. This one needs help because they're trying to be sustainable before being successful. And so that's just one thing that I found is like different between. I don't know about all Europe, but in France, like we have a SARL, une SaaS, and that's it. There's no difference between a tech company that's a SaaS that's trying to have a positive impact and one that doesn't. So I find that this is at least one possible direction to try to improve the status quo. But maybe you have another idea.
I'm wondering if you can give us an example. You said that there are a few in Europe. Could you give us an example of one?
Well, I think what is... I find it hard actually to find example today. What I think there are initiatives today that are interesting from Recommerce, for example, Remade, that are trying to ensure that there's an opportunity not always to buy new stuff, but to buy phones, Remade smartphones, for example, that are still working perfectly. So there's a lot of discussions about the right to repair. For example, in the US, there's been some states that have been pushing laws and stuff like this. But if you think at the smartphone, which is basically, we move from the computer on the desktop, that was only in our office, so now it's in our pocket. We're already thinking, and we're already speaking about the smartphone disappearing probably in the next 5 to 10 years, because everything is going to be server-based. You're going to be able to access to the cloud through something in your ear, something in your watch. So we already know that what we have is going to disappear at some point. So you're kind of saying, should we stop this crazy speed towards putting tech everywhere and be a bit more sensitive about what we have and make it available to everyone?
I mean, I think that's a lot of what ZACK is looking at, and that it's not going away. I mean, the train has left the station, so what we need to figure out now is how do we balance technology in a way that feels more human. So a conversation that we had yesterday, we got together a bit before spending time with you all, and one of the conversations that we had was whether it's low tech or high tech, but more that it's human tech, and that the purpose is to make sure that we're creating in order for us to flourish. And that may mean that there are moments of spaces that are technology free, or that we recognize that it's actually more important to be with one another in person than it is to be on our devices. But I don't have a lot of visibility into anything that's happening, at least in the US, on that front. There are movements about, there's a woman called Jess Davis, and she does this work that's called Folk Rebellion, which is about analog. Like, you know, read newspapers, actual papers, read actual books, because that experience is different than reading your phone. It's the way that the maker intended for you to read the thing, so do it that way. But there isn't anything, I'm not hearing, that's kind of counterculture, at least in the US, so I'm not hearing of anything. Are you guys?
No, I don't have any examples, but I mean, I love the idea. And I mean, I was actually thinking of something like this when I was putting together these slides, because you could switch a user's well-being, you know, as the goal to the planet's well-being or something like that. And you could have all this data coming in, seeing like, well, how is my behavior affecting the planet's health, right? Instead of just my happiness, like I wanted to know basically the well-being of the planet. And then they could give you all these sort of tasks that you could do or ways to adjust. You know, because right now we're just like counting steps and like screen time and stuff like this. But so as the data gets more rich and those sort of change become, you know, sort of more clear, I think you could get really good feedback loops, and that would be really, really interesting to do. I haven't seen anything, but I think that's coming. I hope it's coming. If I wasn't in well-being, it would be one of the things I would work on for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to echo all that. I actually think we're a step ahead in terms of the environment in the US than human well-being and human flourishing, in that we do have these organizations that get tax breaks and are really kind of motivated for various reasons to think about the environment, whereas all this well-being information for individuals is new, and companies don't get tax breaks, they don't have incentives to drive well-being yet. And I actually think if we can create, and there's some talk about this in the community, of organizations in a setup like B Corp, but for human flourishing, we'd be in a better place. All that being caveated with the point that even if environment in the US is a little bit of a step ahead of individual flourishing, I think both of them are just getting started. And there's so much potential and a desire and need to focus on this stuff. So it's a really brilliant question, and clearly I don't think there's been too much thought that we know about that really is going to get us to the next level there.
Thank you.
Is there another question?
Yes, please.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Hi, Thomas. Thank you for all this inspiring speech. I've been thinking about these questions by myself, and I have one question without any answer now. I'd like to have your opinion. Is there any hope for existing companies? I mean, apart from Meetup and all the new companies that exist now, I mean, basically for things like Facebook and Instagram, they purpose, their business model is based on the fact that people spend as much time as possible on their products. And do you think that there is an outcome for them, or should they just disappear?
I have an opinion about that. My concern is that they won't disappear. Like, I think that, and this is not a session about bashing Facebook. They have the enormous potential to do incredible good. But I think that they are a public company, and there's a lot of pressure. And unless they do a complete turnaround on their business model, there's always going to be that tension between potentially doing the right thing for someone's well-being and serving up revenue for their shareholders. And I think that tension is potentially too fraught, and that the money's going to win. And so my concern is that, you know, there's a lot of pushback, at least in the tech community, but most people are still on Facebook and happily on Facebook, even though there's all this swirl of news, especially in the US, around the impact that Facebook has had on the election and on some other things that are pretty disturbing. But people are still on it. And so, you know, I guess my concern is that it's whether there's hope for them. I think that there is hope for them. The hope for them is that they're going to do wildly well and be really, really successful and continue to be successful, and that's going to change the way that we interact with one another.
I don't know the answer to that question. I don't think anyone fully knows the answer to that question at this stage. I think it's really hard, even if you have all the right intentions, to move a ship the size of Facebook and Instagram in the right direction, in part because of their business model, in part because of kind of having a responsibility to their shareholders. It's just a really, really hard thing to do, especially quickly. The way I think about it, and Zach and I have talked about this a little bit, is they're going to try. I think they're really going to try. I think the reason Facebook was invented in the first place was to bring the world closer together. And then they kind of got into this game, fighting for finite attention and trying to grow and be successful. And they got to this place where they are today, which I don't think was their intention. I don't think at all that's what they were trying to do. And I think they realize that. We do see quotes, and Facebook actually invests a lot of money in well-being research, especially for kids. And they pledge millions of dollars to this. Of course, it's hard to distinguish between PR stunts and kind of actually changing what they're doing internally. But I really do believe they want to. And the question for me is, now that they know that there are parts of Facebook that actually drive up well-being, some of these real connections, one-to-one direct messaging, and that they know what a lot of their money comes from, kind of passive scrolling and seeing advertisements leads to decreased well-being, I think they are going to start making tweaks. But the question I have is whether or not those tweaks will be enough compared to someone in this room starting a new company, if they can figure out the right business model that incorporates well-being into it, that can scale to 1 billion users in the next 5 years, and whether or not that's the path forward, that new companies, and Snapchat has their own issues, and they're kind of redefining what friendships look like. But Evan Spiegel, the CEO, always talks about when companies like Facebook and Instagram are copying kind of what they do, they say, that's life, and they're trying to do what we're doing, and that's okay, but they can't copy our core values. And their core values aren't likes. Spiegel says that every mentor that comes to him tries to get him to do likes on Snapchat, and he has to patiently explain that's not what we're about. We're about real social connections, one-on-one connections. And so I don't know if these big companies can steer the ship, and or if new companies are going to come in the next 5 or 10 years, kind of erode what Facebook has. But it's going to be really interesting to follow along.
If there is no other question, I have a... Oh, there is another, sorry.
Hi guys. You talked a little bit about measuring impact based on happiness, and that feels that can feel a bit difficult to measure and not very tangible compared to other business metrics. How do you, for those of us who are interested in implementing those changes and being more mission-driven and so forth, how would you recommend assessing how the culture you've developed in the company is being successful at having an impact, and how do you measure impact on happiness from your product?
Zach, you have some early measures from the hardware you built, I think?
Yeah, well, there's a study around space where they make bedrooms off limits, right? And they test the well-being. But so the way to do that is there's a bunch of scales that you can use, right? There's basically questionnaires that you can use, like a PERMA scale or a PANAS scale, which measures mood, right? So that's one way. I think that's the lowest hanging fruit to do. I think it's easier for bigger companies to do, right? So you can implement something, and you can just do a pre and post, right, with your user. But it's getting really interesting because there's sort of this machine learning, there's natural language processing that's bearing fruit as well, and that's just automated, right? So you make implementation on your user interface, and you can measure the language that's happening on with that user, and you can see if you've moved the needle on well-being just by just AI processing their language, which is really exciting. There was one study that just measured optimism on a Twitter feed, in a community, and they ended up being able to predict heart disease better than the CDC, the Center for Disease Control. So, and that's all automated. It took no man hours, right? Once you set it up, it's basically there, and you get this really good dashboard of like what is going on. So if you try to do some sort of, you can do that probably with a company, something like that, right? Like you have your whole community Twitter feed, and then you do some sort of intervention, and you could see if it's moving the needle. So there's stuff like that out there, and it's just getting better. It's getting better, those tools.
Yeah, and in addition to that, I think there's going to be a pretty big breakthrough coming soon on this stuff as more and more people are interested in it, in that a lot of the academic language that they use to measure these things is really tough to kind of like the idea of putting it out to your customers, maybe that are just using your software or coming to your platform. But there are ways to, and it's sort of happening now, and ideas around taking this academic language and breaking it and parsing it into kind of user-friendly language that you can ask them after they use your app or do something on your software of whether or not sort of it drove increase in positive emotion or happiness at kind of the highest level. And depending on what your product is, you can actually then like build that into your mechanisms and say, hey, we're doing this thing, is this driving sort of what we want it to do? And if yes, how can we drive more of that? And Facebook started to do that a little bit, which is how they found sort of, oh, there's one way to use Facebook that's really good and this other way that's not as good. And I think over the next few years, as kind of this research bubbles up and more people in tech want to start optimizing for these things, there'll be more and better language for us to use going forward.
Yeah. So we have another 45 minutes together, so I'm just going to make sure, because I have a few questions for you that I want to make sure we can tackle this morning. And then for the last 15 minutes, we'll go back to the public. Again, at some point during the presentation, I think it was you, Alex, you said, you know, the question is not if we can do something now when we were thinking about the products that we're building, the products that we're designing. You said the question is like, should we? And I think we live in a culture, or like at least most of tech companies' culture, like they're more focused on the can we, because we have specific people that are responsible for the can we, right? The capacity. So we're going to go to an engineer and we're going to say like, can you do that? Like, is it possible to build? And we're going to do the same when we go to a designer. We're like, hey, can you build an interface that does this? Can it be responsive? Could we send a notification at that time? Can we send a notification if 2 people liked your stuff? So we're in that, can we do this? Like, is it possible to make perspective? Because we have these you know, these skills that people have learned, and that's their answer. If we try to shift to a culture of like, should we? Like, does it make sense? Will it hurt well-being or will it create like more flourishing? Who should we talk to within a company? Like, how do you, who's addressing the answer? Who's giving an answer to that should we question?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I don't think it's happening nearly enough today, and maybe in part because we don't have the right people in the companies that can offer that or shift us in that direction. I want to use Google as an example to help answer this in kind of 2 different examples. And the first is sort of what happens when, at a grassroots level, people kind of have these thoughts and probably have these discussions. And I mentioned it briefly in the presentation, but they're at the forefront of AI and using this technology for so many different things, some of which are really, really great, and some of which actually could have potential negative effects. And this partnership deal with the US government, specifically with the military, was about using AI to make the military kind of more efficient, specifically around kind of how can they use maps and learn through AI, sort of like where to target certain things. And it ended up with, I think, 12 employees at Google resigning. And these are like, you know, artificial intelligence engineers. Like these are really sought after employees, and it got to a point where they had to resign. This isn't there for, they can make it. Of course they can do it. And they were really having the question of, should we? And it got to a point where this bubbled up to the CEO, and they're not renewing their contract next year. And unfortunately, it got to this point. It didn't necessarily have to. On the other side of Google, there's this guy, Tristan Harris, who now runs an organization called Center for Humane Technology. It used to be called Time Well Spent. And he was also an employee at Google a few years ago. And he wrote a memo to the company that also bubbled up to the CEO at the time, talking about building things for humanity and building things for human values. And they actually changed his role title to design ethicist. And so he was actually going around and working with product managers and played this role of, should we do this? He left Google to go found this organization that's making a lot of the impact in Silicon Valley and in the US of getting this actual change to happen. So he shifted his focus there. But if more companies could adopt or maybe replace design ethicists when they leave, or create this role around should we, and maybe even well-being experts bringing them in, I think that discussion will be a lot more fruitful, and I think we'll get to a point where we don't have engineers resigning because they're building things that they can and not that they should.
And that's a question of culture, Caroline, right? Because when, like, that's a good example. Like I imagine that when Tristan Harris left Google and like had to start this thing on his own, like that's also because he saw that there was potential for like design ethics like beyond Google, but that's also because potentially like he reached a point where he's just the person that gets in the way of building stuff, right? Like and like if you're just the person who's here to come and say like, no, we should not do this. All right, bye. That was my answer. Like I imagine that he realized that it's a tough position to be in. So I'm just so interested in, you know, if we say like if you think about what was in the past, like the 50s and the 60s in the US, it's the boom of communication and marketing and advertising. And the reason why these people were called madmen is because at some point they had no boundaries. They were advertising for everything that's bad, including like smoking and stuff, and they were just going with the craziest idea. And it was already the beginning of like finite attention, right? You're just trying to grab people's attention, to look at your ad, to buy stuff. And we're doing the same these days. So how do we not become the new madmen, madwoman as well? It's just like, the design ethicist position is interesting, but like, do you have any idea how at a company we don't put just one person in that role and that person just becomes like the person that gets in the way? And like, how can we spread this across the company in general?
Well, yeah, so for someone like Tristan, he would feel a little bit like the gatekeeper, right? Nobody wants him in the room because he's just always saying no without coming up with any solutions, or potentially coming up with solutions but that don't drive the bottom line, or not quickly. And so I think that in a perfect world, it starts with the senior leadership team. So the senior leadership team is aligned on the kind of impact that they want to have in the world, and they're committed to that impact even when there's a shorter term, more profitable solution on the table, which I think is really difficult to turn down, especially when you're a publicly traded company. So there is no solution to that, I don't think, other than making sure that the senior leadership team in any company is aligned on the real purpose and mission of the company, and that everyone that works there, it always surprises me when senior leadership teams don't really heavily rely on the team that they have, because otherwise why are you writing them a paycheck? You know, if you're just going to make all the decisions, then you don't need the team there. And so I think that if you create a culture like I imagine someone like Food Assembly has, where they are really relying on the entire team to bubble up ideas and then to push those ideas forward, I think that helps. I think staying private helps. I mean, I don't know how it works here in France, but certainly in the US, once you go public, there's a lot more pressure that feels at least out of your control to shareholders and earnings. And I guess that's it. I don't have an answer to that. I think that those two things could help.
No, that's super interesting, because then that also means that as an engineer or as a designer, if you're joining a company and you're interviewing for the job, like, you know, sometimes you're trying to think about the mission. It's like, oh, if you like music, you're going to try to go to like Spotify, SoundCloud and stuff. But now what you're saying is also like, you should know what's already on the mind of the leadership team. Like, what are they committed to? Like, what are the things they talk about the most when they talk about their mission and their business model? And because at the end of the day, what you're saying is that it will come from them in some ways if they decide to like be a decision maker on like more shorter term like gains that are not helping people flourish versus like people flourishing because they're aligned together, like the CTO, the CPO on like more longer term work. Zach, I have a question for you, because I was looking at your slide. You have this logo, this no smoking logo, right? And just below you have the same thing for the smartphone. And you were talking on that slide about like, oh, we need to create these spaces, right? Because at some point we realized that smoking was bad, so we said, you know, we're not smoking in these public spaces. But the we here is not the company. That logo didn't come from like people that are making tobacco, right? It wasn't like Philip Morris didn't decide that, oh, we know it's bad, so now let's do this. It's governments, it's legislation. And I think we felt the first wave, especially for people that are in the room. I always forget the order of the initial in French, but like GDPR in English, like that's legislation coming from Europe, not waiting on Facebook to like change their business model or shifting, but telling them like, if you're gonna sell ads, you're gonna sell ads, but you're gonna collect data in a different way. You're gonna ask people for consent. You're gonna make sure that you're not sharing personal information. Do you think that we are at that same, that we have reached that same level when it comes to smartphone? Like we need legislation on like how they're being used and stuff to go back to your logo, or should it come first from people making things like you are with Ransomly?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think both would be great. And I think France is way ahead, right, of the US, right? Because you guys have some law about emailing people after 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. or something like that, right? You can't do that, or it's discouraged or something like that. We have nothing like that in the States. So ideally from both. I mean, I would love to see it more. We're starting to see it in Silicon Valley, just in tech spheres. It's great there because it's so much faster, right? Like, I mean, government takes so long. And then even when it happens, like the bills you get, the laws you get are usually imperfect, right? So, yeah, I mean, my biggest hope is in the tech industry to do this, right? I think, like Carolyn said, like just senior leadership and big companies being just dedicated to this and just fighting their shareholders if they have to, and then startups coming up and scaling with this idea that no, like human well-being is the priority, and that's what we're going to do, and we'll try to build a business model around that. But yeah, I mean, as awareness rises and people are more educated on the impacts it's having on them and on their children, I could see legislation coming down the pipeline as well. So, I mean, the short answer is both. I think would be helpful.
And at some point during because the reason why we would want to like avoid being on our smartphone all the time and like have more control about it, it's all of you talked specifically about finite attention. Like, could we spend like a little more time on this? Like, what does it mean exactly, and how is tech already optimizing for it? Like, if you can give like a few examples, because out of all the things that are definitely not helping people flourish, like it's that exact competition that everyone has like for finite attention, and it's funny because it can be like a news feed, it can be like a Netflix TV show. They seem to be like very different mediums, but they are all actually trying to tackle the same. They all have the same goal, so they are kind of all in competition during the day for like every user. So like, could you talk a little bit about that a little more, and like how the tech industry is centered around that these days?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one thing that is, like, as you brought up, these are different mediums, it seems like, right? You have Netflix and you have something like Facebook. But when we talk about like optimizing for attention, I mean, part of it is just the data model. That's how they define you, right? So these are, like, Facebook is defining you on what you pay attention to. I mean, their outcomes are a little bit different, like where it's some sort of article on whatever, Kanye West versus, positive psychology or something like that. And Netflix is, they're looking at what you pay attention to in terms of entertainment, right? So what show that you really like. But ultimately, you have these huge engines, these machine learning, just trying to get that data model about you, but the end goal is attention. So these are very, very similar, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, if you take a step back and you think about these companies, a lot of these companies make money from advertising, some through subscriptions. The only way they can thrive in this attention economy is to have your attention and have you on their platform, and it's finite, right? There's only so many hours a day, and not including sleep, although you do hear CEOs of these companies saying, one of our biggest competitors is sleep, because they're trying to like widen the pie as opposed to kind of fight the other ones that are already doing really well. And I think what you find is they have thousands of engineers working, like really smart engineers working to figure out how they can get more of your finite attention than the next company that has thousands of engineers trying to figure out how they can get, like, this is what the technology industry is focused on. This is what like these incredibly smart engineers are spending their time doing, and they don't really have much of a choice today, as long as this is their business model. And just like to give an example, when one company innovates, so YouTube figures out autoplay or some better algorithm to show the next thing that's going to capture them, which tends to be, by the way, not really positive things, but kind of controversial things, because that's what people want to click on, then Facebook has to figure out how to drive autoplay and get the content that people are going to click on, which leads to Facebook updating their algorithm to get more clicks and be more persuasive. And the amount of data that they have about us means like they can show an ad that you're going to click on, essentially, right? Like they know so much about us that if you live in the middle of the US and you have a kid and you tend to vote, and like they will show you an ad that's going to be persuasive for you to click on, and that's how they're going to keep you on their platform. And so I think that's a little bit around how these tech companies think and sort of optimize their time, both kind of human work hours and just what they're trying to get out in the world. And unfortunately, it doesn't, as you guys have seen with the data, it doesn't always lend itself to increased well-being. It often is in exact conflict with that.
I think the thing that surprises me about it is that, I mean, because that's going to happen. I mean, I do think that there's a responsibility for the technology companies to pay attention to the impact that their work is having in the world, but that's a very high bar. And frankly, I don't know that I buy that most companies will try to reach that threshold. So what I find surprising is that I'm getting sucked in. You know, that I know that it's happening, and I'm sitting back, and 3 hours later, I've watched 4 horrible shows on Netflix because they keep serving them up. And so I know it's happening, and I'm still participating. So I feel like the only way we're gonna shift out of this cycle that we've started to get in is awareness, everybody's awareness around what's happening, so that we can all make a choice to say, listen, we know that this exists, and sometimes it's really fun, and sometimes I just need 3 hours to chill and not think about what's happening in the world and watch Netflix. But I need to have that awareness and make it a choice and say that I'm doing this, instead of it feeling like it's not a choice, like it just starts to become a habit that you can't get out of. So I think that just creating awareness around the fact that this is the way that some technology works would make a big difference.
I couldn't agree more. And I love the fact that we're even having this conversation where people might start to realize they subconsciously pick up their phone on average 150 times a day. And kids are sending hundreds of texts every day, and often without even really thinking about it. And so the more we can be aware, the better. And I think there are a few companies out there that don't make money in the same way that can help us. And Apple is a really good example. There was a letter from, in this instance, a letter from the shareholders to Apple saying, like, you guys need to own up to what people are doing on your phone. That's your responsibility. And Apple makes money in a lot of different ways, but in part from selling phones and not necessarily the amount of time you spend on their phones. And I think this discussion and some of the persuasiveness that has happened around Silicon Valley and Apple has led to this new product or new feature around kind of screen time, which allows you to at least see what kind of the data consumption of apps looks like, and actually tell it, hey, I only want to spend an hour today on XYZ app, and it will remind you after an hour is up, so that you can at least be aware, and maybe that will start to combat some of these psychological tricks that have been kind of compared to what it's like to be gambling, where you just don't want to stop, and they're so good at that. Maybe kind of Apple and Google potentially could really help in that world.
It's super interesting because we were talking about Netflix. I don't know, does anyone watch 13 Reasons Why on Netflix? All right, keep your hands up if you're below 25 years old. Can you keep your hand up? Yeah, so mostly everyone. So I have 3 little sisters, and I also know quite a lot of teenagers in the US. And I didn't watch the TV show initially, but the first time someone talked to me about it, it was like, oh, you know, like it's a TV show, it's about being in high school, and it's about suicide, right? And I was like, that's pretty intense. Like that's definitely drama, and it's just that TV show. But then when you hear the teenager that are talking about it, that are watching it, and they're so into it, it's because they don't consider that it's exceptional. For sure, there is a part of the TV show itself that has like some drama, like to go to that level. But the way they talk about what's happening in the TV show in terms of their relationship to social media and like, you know, like online bullying and stuff, the way they relate to that TV show so much is just because that's exactly what that younger generation, you know, lived. Like when I was in high school, we definitely had like a mobile phone, but we just had text mostly. That was it, and like MSN Messenger at the time. But now it feels like it's so intense. It's like Snapchat and stuff. It's like finite attention is bad in general, of like trying to grab people's attention, and we want to do more flourishing. But when you were showing your slides, it seemed that we're not even at -10. Like we might already be with, depending on the generation, right? We might already be at -20. And so if that's why I was asking about legislation, because I feel a bit like Caroline. I feel like I'm not sure it's gonna be fast. I'm not sure that companies are gonna change fast enough to catch up on the bad that they're doing, because it's not just like if kids react to a TV show that's about like, you know, technology being like having the worst possible effect, that means that it's already there and it's already having this impact. And so I'm just wondering, you're saying that flourishing, right, is like trying to go from if you're not having depression, like if you're not between -10 to 0, then we can flourish. But do you still think that there is innovation between -10 to 0 that's happening? Like, do you have example of companies that are like, you know, we would definitely love for you to have like relationships and stuff, but right now we're trying to already get you from like -10 to 0, you know?
Yeah, I don't know as much about that world to probably give the best answer, but I guess there's kind of like two angles on this. One is there are tech companies that are, and just technology in general, that's being used by hospitals and therapists in a lot of really unique ways to actually improve their ability to treat people that are dealing with mental illness, anxiety, depression, PTSD, all those things. I don't know too much about it, but I do know that it's being kind of intertwined into the mechanisms that people use. And it's not only to treat, but oftentimes to kind of get ahead of and detect, and in some cases prevent. So there is a lot of work, and of course technology can be used in that way. I think the really sad thing for me is knowing that a lot of technology, when we're talking about flourishing and using technology to help people flourish, still lives within that -10 to 0 world, and is actually kind of fueling the need for traditional psychology, because we're creating generations of kids with higher depression, anxiety, and suicide rates than ever before. And you know, I think government would be an amazing thing to help step in that case. But I really have a lot of faith in, now that we have this research, and it is early days of this research. Like, it's not like we've had this for 30 years and have been kind of building on top of it. It's sort of like we're just realizing how bad this can be. I really believe that we'll be able to kind of address these issues from a tech side as well, not just to help maybe prevent and treat, but also just to make sure that we're not adding more of that, because that's the last thing that we need to do with technology.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, because yeah, we've created this environment that is not optimal for well-being, and so it means there's going to be a lot of this sort of -10 depression, anxiety stuff, and there is a lot of work in that field. One I'm aware of is AI therapists, which the early results look promising, so that could be really great, because and I think they're using it right now for PTSD with the military, and I mean, it's obviously it can scale, so that's awesome, right? You could just be one click away from a therapist once they get that dialed in. There's also some interesting work around bullying, like where they have there's like natural language processing about the comment you're about to post, and then if it looks like it might be bullying, it'll stop you, right, and kind of coach you, say, are you sure you want to do that, and try to build some empathy for the person that might read that. I think that's really really interesting. And then even right now, the sort of telemedicine stuff is good. So you know, you can be on Facebook and you maybe just be 2 clicks away from talking to a therapist, you know, through the video chat or something like that. So I think all that stuff is really good, and I hope it just continues. But I think it's an important problem as well.
Yeah, and it's a good example, because I didn't know about that AI work to like be able to replace therapy. Like, because therapy is very expensive. I mean, it depends, but in the US, it's definitely on the expensive side, right? If you want to see a therapist like every week or every other week, and it's around like $100, like that's a huge amount at the end of the year. And so if with AI we can make that, we can build that to scale, you know, that's obviously we're offering it to the masses, which is great, and it has proven to improve people's well-being. But you look at the conference 2 weeks ago, that's why we were talking about incentives for big companies and hope that they're going to change. Google introduced the first example that they have of AI, you know, like answering a very interesting mission, and it's just to book your next haircut, you know, and it's just like a robot talking to an actual human being and trying to replace you and be like, oh, you know, like I would love to get my haircut, okay, and the robot's like, you know, just like making that person feel like they're talking to a human person, and that would have been an amazing example to show instead, or like show that they're working on that. And so, yeah, I just think there is, this is an amazing example of like, again, technology by itself is completely neutral, like every form of technique or new skill that people acquire, it's like what we do with it as an industry, whether we're like designers, engineers, strategists, like what we do with it. But that's another example. And I think when we were saying earlier, like 2018 is like a critical year, it's because I think for the past 20 years we were kind of in the realm of tech is good, so not neutral, but like really good. If there's some side effects, that's okay, right? But you know, like the web was supposed to be decentralized and perfect, and like technology in general is just like great innovation. Sometimes there are a few downsides, and I think 2018 is the year where everyone is realizing that, you know, no, actually unchecked, most of it is not okay, because the reaction that Google got, for example, at that conference, you know, is super interesting. And then that's what led to the quote from the CEO, is realizing, hey, we did this demo, we're super happy about the technology, and we realized that maybe we could have shown the demo differently, or we could have done things differently. But yeah, this is super interesting to know and be aware that there are things like this for which AI would be like an amazing thing. One thing that I saw on your slide, Alex, and that goes back to the framework that you introduced, ZACK, on the side of the, not that it's like just like, oh, they are like the good companies and the bad companies, right? But you had like a slide with all the companies on the right that people quoted as like, they're making me the most unhappy. I couldn't help but notice that 3 of them were dating apps. But on the other side, you were showing on your slides that, you know, romantic relationship or like finding love is one of the things that's supposed to make you the happiest, or like makes you flourish. So why do you think is that we have a huge disconnect between the fact that these are the worst app technically, like if you ask people like how they feel, but their mission, because it's about their mission, and so their mission initially is like, oh, we're going to try to like, you know, help you find like a relationship, and that mission is actually great initially, like it's supposed to be great because it's supposed to make you flourish. Like, why do you think that disconnect is happening?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, right? Because so I looked for studies on dating apps because I'm really interested in how technology can drive human connection. And I think it's pretty incredible what's happening right now as far as technology driving romantic relationships and marriages. And I've always been wondering, I would love to find, if someone can find and send it to me, sort of like the marriages that happen from people meeting on dating apps as a percentage of all marriages, and what that curve looks like. But I think if you remember that slide, there's kind of 2 dimensions on it. One of the dimensions is kind of how did you feel after using this? And another dimension is how many minutes per day are you using this? And I think this is where it gets really exciting as far as us being able to leverage this data to do the right thing. I think dating apps are an amazing invention, and it's connecting people that maybe otherwise wouldn't be able to connect. I'd love to see the research at some point. But you can also imagine someone going on dating apps and spending 3 hours a day trying to find the perfect person. And maybe if you used it for 20 minutes and were kind of, okay, satisficing, or kind of finding someone that looked really great to move to the next level, as opposed to comparing everyone or scrolling for hours and hours and making that sort of what you do, I think it might have a really big change in happiness. And so my assumption is that these dating apps have a lot of potential to drive happiness, and ideally they would be kind of created in a way that you maybe only use it for 20 minutes a day, as opposed to, you know, hours and hours of scrolling, to actually achieve that right balance. But I actually think some of the ability for us to even limit ourselves ahead of time, it's really hard to get off some of these apps when you're on them. All these psychological tricks have been made so that that's the case. But if ahead of time you can work with Apple or Google, or maybe when you wake up say, hey, I want to spend 10 minutes a day, I know that's kind of like the right happiness level for me, and then have Google or Apple say, hey, you spent 10 minutes on this, why don't you get outside or do something else, or even block you, right? That's not the craziest thing in the world. I think that can be a really positive thing. In the same way where there's a lot of dating apps that might be built differently, and I would love to live in a world, and this is in part something that Tristan Harris and the Center for Humane Technology have thought of, which is app stores right now are kind of ranked in terms of downloads and frequency of downloads and getting the most popular thing. But what if we were measuring kind of how you feel or kind of how much well-being it drives, and we ranked by that? And all of a sudden maybe the right dating apps would show up because those are the ones built to have you spend the least amount of time but kind of find the right matches. And I think there's just so much potential in that world that hopefully we'll start seeing some changes over the next few years.
Sorry. That's interesting because you were saying that, the App Store could be, like apps on the App Store could be rated on well-being, right? And that goes back to the question from the public a bit earlier. Like, it's so easy right now to have like that one measure that we can use in tech for attention. Like, we have that many active users, and like they're monthly, they're weekly, they're yearly, whatever. Like, we have active users, and that's just a big umbrella number to either sold that number to advertisers or just make sure that you're on top of the App Store. If tomorrow, like we lived in, let's say, like, there is a big change of mind starts to happen tomorrow, like what do you think would be the one metric that could start to pop up everywhere? Because you were showing a lot of research and a lot of studies, and the results are super clear, but they're all kind of like different numbers every time. If you were to just pick one and say, like, here is how we could measure here is how the tech industry and most companies in the tech industry could measure like their impact, like what would it be if you were to only pick one?
That's a little bit limiting, especially because ZACK showed us that well-being is kind of comprised of these 5 different elements, and one of those elements being kind of engagement, and another one being accomplishment. And so, how you kind of want to respond after using a Duolingo or some kind of software around learning, it might not be happiness, right? It might be engagement or the sense of moving in the right direction in terms of productivity. Compared to using maybe social media, where it might be around, are we driving stronger relationships and better connections, which is a part of well-being, versus using like a YouTube, and maybe you're just, you're tired at the end of the day and it's all about, you just want positive emotion or humor and happiness. And so that's a long-winded answer to saying I don't want to answer your question. I think if I had to, the easiest thing would just be sort of, how did you feel after using this? And I think you can use a scale of kind of 1 to 10 to maybe encompass all these different things, where maybe you didn't experience positive emotion, but you feel like a 10 because you got what you want out of it. And then we can maybe even rank according to how people felt after they used an app would be a pretty good start.
But I thought that well-being encompassed all those things. So I thought that was the benefit of measuring well-being, because then you're capturing those 5 qualities. Is that not right?
That's exactly right. I think this raises a really good question, and sort of a problem that I'm facing often, kind of straddling academia and technology, is that the language we use in academia is really thoughtful and validated and precise, but it's not necessarily the language you and I would use if we were having kind of a casual conversation. And so asking people at the end of using an app or something like that, sort of like, rate your well-being on a scale of 1 to 10, that just could be confusing. People might not know what it means. And so using a proxy, and I would love to have someone in academia actually spend the work to like correlate these things, which is what a lot of academia is. But something like, how do you feel after, might be a really good way to get close to well-being without specifically asking them to understand and use that language.
And so that's a super interesting insight for like anyone who's working in tech, right? Basically, you're saying that right now what we're tracking is one number and we're tracking it passively, right? We're just saying to people, you know, like we're putting, the way we're measuring it is just like as soon as someone enters the website or the apps, we know how much time they're spending on it because we're in that finite attention competition. It's like they have 24 hours during the day, 7 days during the week. So we're measuring how many days during the week they're coming, right? So it's like 3 days, okay, they're weekly users. And then we're saying like they're spending on average 3 hours. And so we have no idea if it's making them feel better, but at least we're tracking this, so that's the number we're pushing. And so what you're saying that a much better way to do this, so if we're like in for like the engineers, the designer, everyone in the room who's working on a product, like a good way to change that metric or like start pushing another information to shareholder, if you're a public company, or like your investor, or even your users, if you want to communicate about it, is saying like define the one question that goes back to the 5 pillar that you talked about, like relationships, engagement, purpose, and just like have one question right after the experience, and have it be ranked between like 1 to 10 is like a better way to like evaluate how your company or your product is having a positive impact.
Yeah,
would that be right? Or?
Yeah, I think that would be great, and I think I don't know. It would be really curious to see if kind of users of technology would be open to this. Like the truth is, I use my smartphone way more than I should, and I don't even know when I'm using it. Like there are times where I'll just like go into my pocket and bring it out, and I don't know why I'm there. And there are other times where I go to do something, and then I'll do 12 other things because I got a notification, and I don't do the thing, so I bring my phone back out. It's a weird thing to be able to kind of admit that and realize that how much that's changing my life, and often probably not for the positive. So for me personally, and I realize I'm kind of one anecdote, I would love the ability to just kind of like click a button after I use an app and maybe rank some of these things. And maybe in a month's time, I'll get to a place where I'll actually be really conscious and aware of which apps I'm using, how often, and how they make me feel. And then I can actually kind of design my environment, which in this case is like my phone, accordingly. Sort of like if I want to go for a run, I have to put out my running shoes and my clothes the night before because I'm going to wake up and I'm just not going to want to do it. So that forces me. If I knew how I was using my app better and I knew kind of what I wanted to get out of life, and I could have different apps show up at different times of days, or even just remove them entirely from my phone to allow me to have that right environment, I want to say I'd be really welcome to it. I don't know exactly what that would look like or if other people would, but I think that'd be a pretty amazing thing.
Yeah, and that's super interesting because to Zach's point, like about like if we want, like we can redesign the UX, like that already exists, right? Because when you take a Uber, at the end of every ride, you have to rate the driver. So they're using that pop-up question that comes after the experience for that purpose, which is like rating the driver. But you could use it for everything, right? If you watch a video on YouTube, it's like, how does that make me feel? Like, if it was a conspiracy theory video or like a super violent video, like, it'd be like, actually, I'm not sure about that. Instead of just letting the algorithm just show you the next video kind of like constantly, you know?
Yeah, and maybe there's a way to do it that isn't so intrusive. So maybe you don't have to do this after every Uber ride. Maybe like the first of every month, you kind of, you know, the first week, maybe you go through this exercise, or maybe you know enough at some point where you can just say, hey, I want to use Headspace, Meetup, and Duolingo more, and you can just kind of set the tone for that month, and those are the apps that show up, and then the next month maybe you go through this exercise again, and you can shift if you need to. I think if you can do this in a really light touch way, it's a really good opportunity that users won't necessarily get upset or have to change their behavior too much.
Yeah, we have a few minutes before wrapping up, so I just want to make sure if anyone has a question that you get a chance to ask your question. Okay, so one thing that we talked about as well, we were talking about, you know, you showed quotes and you talked about Facebook as well, like you were comparing the about page, right? It's like what you're trying to advertise as your mission, and at some point you mentioned like the quotes coming from the CEO, like whether it's like Google, Facebook and all the others. Could you tell me, because you worked at Amazon, right? Like most companies have like one one goal, one metric that they're trying to track? Like, could you give me the? Cause you talked to me about that like a few months ago. Like, what was the one at Amazon when they're trying to, like, what's their mission and what's the goal that they're tracking? And do you feel like there's a? Is it connected, disconnected? Like.
Yeah, Amazon's a little bit of a tricky one because it's so big and so diverse that various teams and departments have very different goals. The mission is really an incredible one. I really enjoyed my time at Amazon because it's very customer-centric, and they try to be, and part of their mission is being Earth's most customer-centric company.
Okay, that's their mission.
Yeah, and I think they do a really good job of that typically, and it kind of bubbles down into the meetings we have, and there's always the customer represented. But when it comes down to some of the work we do, oftentimes for a lot of the teams, especially on the retail side, is revenue. Not so much about profits because they've somehow created this environment where that's okay. But when I was working there, a lot of my time was kind of how do I get people who are spending money on Amazon to spend more money on Amazon. Really challenging problems, and I really smart people, and I really enjoyed it. But I think once I got towards kind of my 5-year mark, I took a step back and had to kind of think about, do I want to be focusing all my energy on getting people to spend more money? And not to say Amazon's not doing amazing things, I think they are. But having that kind of moment to step back is what brought me into positive psychology and the wanting and kind of almost needing to work for a positive technology company, or at least straddle those lines. And so I think for me, moving from a place where my goals were around how much revenue am I driving or how many app downloads am I driving, stuff like that, just it got to a point where I learned that wasn't really, even though I was feeling important and making a difference and working at scale, it just wasn't really what kind of the world's about. And I think we saw that when people raised their hands and said, what do they want? It wasn't like they want this next thing or this material thing. It was they want to live a life of flourishing, right? And so for me, moving away from Amazon towards a positive technology company was sort of an easy one.
Yeah, this is super interesting, Zach. You know, you showed how your system works, right? You have like a Bluetooth activated beacon. That beacon, as soon as it's in close proximity with your phone, it shuts down your phone. I remember the early days of that technology, like 4 years ago, when everyone was talking about the potential for like the first scenarios that we had in mind right away, which I think are a good example of like where our industry sometimes is a bit just has the wrong thinking overall. But like all the white papers and stuff were all about like you can use this in store and you can tell people, like you can know that people are like at Uniqlo and they're like buying shorts, and so you can send them like so we can push even more stuff to their screen. It's so interesting that you're using it to do some like exactly the opposite. Like, oh, you're here, we're shutting down your phone. But the only thing is that because it's not enabled by Apple, you have to download an app, right? And so my question to you is like, what would be the completely ideal scenario if you were working closely with Apple? If you had like direct access to the hardware, if you were building like the next feature with them, and you were not like independent and people would not have to download an app, like could you describe for us like your ideal UX for that experience to create like spaces for humanity?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, we baked into the hardware, right? So their operating system, and then they would have these beacons that would be very low cost, and any sort of business or a person could get them easily, and then you can opt in. So when you opt in, you get in range, your iPhone shuts down. That would be seamless, would be, I think would help a lot of people. And I think I would add one other thing that would sort of give that control, that idea of these beacons working on their phone to someone else too. So you have the option to, so you don't cheat yourself, right? Because it does get frustrating sometimes when you're like, I was looking at that feed and it shuts down. So, but that would be incredible if they did that. I think it would be super interesting. We get a lot more real life connections.
I'm just curious if you've tried to sell or work with like partners, like restaurants or something that wants to be known for you come in and you enjoy the meal and like that's what you're doing, where they could just have like a beacon or a couple beacons around, or if you've had any of those conversations.
Yeah, we're starting those conversations. Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I just saw a cafe that they encourage like discussions around and conversations just around like sort of emotional well-being, mental health. Like you're supposed to check in. Like a lot of the employees, the baristas there are trained in this. So places like that for sure. But yeah, I really like that idea where you just want to focus on the food or the company or the work or something like that. Yeah, we're in talks right now for that kind of stuff.
So we're gonna wrap up. Carolyn, Zach, Alex, was really, thank you so much for sharing all of this today and getting us in a space where I feel like we know a little more about positive technology and like potentially whatever we're working on, whether it's a product or service, if we're like designer, engineer, or even if we're like in the marketing department, because we saw that it has impact, like the way we talk about the impact of our product. Like I feel like there's tons of things from this morning that we can put into our work. So just wanted to thank you and thank everyone for listening to us and participating and asking questions. We'll be hanging out in the main hall area. So yeah, if you have any questions, just come and hang out with us. Thanks a lot.